Picture a damp spring evening in April 1927. Families huddled inside farmhouses across the Mississippi Delta, the relentless rhythm of rain drumming on the tin roofs. Just a wet season in the South, or so it seemed. But just beyond the earthen wall at the edge of town, something was building. A force so powerful it was fed by failing tributaries across 31 states, swelling until it towered higher than the rooftops. It was a disaster that would turn the Delta into an inland sea, displace hundreds of thousands, and become the most destructive river flood in American history, the Great Flood of 1927. A catastrophe that didn't just break levees, it redefined the geography of the United States. This wasn't just rising water. This was a living, breathing monster coming for everything and everyone in its path. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and river mud, and the dirt roads had turned to gumbo that sucked the boots right off your feet. But as people looked out their windows at the gray world, they didn't realize this wasn't just a storm. It was a slow-motion execution. To understand the sheer scale of what happened in 1927, you have to look at the months leading up to the break. The trouble didn't start in April. It began the summer before, in 1926, when the rains simply refused to quit. By the time the new year rolled around, the ground was already saturated, unable to drink another drop. Then came the spring melt. The Ohio, the Missouri, the Arkansas, all the great arteries of the continent, were flushing their icy meltwater into the Mississippi all at once. The river had nowhere to go but up. In some places, the water level rose to 56 feet on the gauge. The only thing standing between civilization and total annihilation were the levees. By the 1920s, the levees-only policy was the gospel of the Army Corps of Engineers. They believed they could corset the river, force it into a narrow channel, and make it dig its own bed deeper. They were wrong. Instead of digging down, the river pushed up, and so the people built the walls higher. Life in the Delta became a singular obsession, watching the levees. It was a gritty, muddy existence. The sensory overload of the era was dominated by the roar of the current and the frantic activity on the embankments. The government and local planners mobilized an army to fight the water. This is where the social history turns dark. It wasn't just volunteers filling sandbags. It was a system of forced labor that looked uncomfortably like the past the country claimed to have moved on from. Thousands of men, predominantly African-American sharecroppers, were conscripted into levee gangs. They were rounded up by police and plantation overseers, sometimes at gunpoint, and forced to live in makeshift camps right on top of the muddy embankments. They worked in shifts that defied human endurance, filling heavy burlap sacks with wet sand, piling them onto the sodden earth as the rain lashed their faces. If you were there, you would hear the chanting. To keep the rhythm of the work, to keep from collapsing under the weight of the sandbags, the men sang low, mournful work songs mixed with the sound of the rising gale. They were fueled by meager rations and fear. At night, the levees were lit by the flickering orange glow of torches and bonfires, casting long, dancing shadows against the black, churning water. The river was often feet higher than the land they were standing on, held back only by a mound of dirt and the desperate labor of exhausted men. Then came Good Friday, April 15th, 1927. A storm of biblical proportions parked itself over the region. In New Orleans, huge raindrops hammered the pavement, totaling 15 inches in just 18 hours. The pressure in the river system was building to a breaking point. The water was pressing against the levees with a force that physics could barely calculate. The engineers watched for sand boils, little geysers of water bubbling up on the dry side of the levee, a sign that the river was tunneling underneath the wall. When a boil was spotted, men would rush to ring it with sandbags, trying to equalize the pressure. It was a game of whack-a-mole played against the most powerful force of nature on the continent, but the river would not be denied. On April 21st, at Mounds Landing, Mississippi, the battle was lost. It didn't start with a trickle. It started with a sound like a cannon shot, the earth snapping under the strain. At 8 a.m., the levee, which men had died trying to reinforce, liquefied. The break at Mounds Landing remains the single greatest crevasse ever to occur on the Mississippi River. When the wall gave way, it didn't just leak, it exploded. A wall of water, described by survivors as looking like a brown mountain, crashed through the breach. The force was so violent it snapped telephone poles like toothpicks and scoured the earth down to the bedrock. The roar was so loud it drowned out the screams of the workers, who were swept away in an instant. The water poured through the gap at a rate double the volume of Niagara Falls. It wasn't just water. It was a slurry of trees, barns, livestock, and debris. The river had reclaimed the land. Within hours, the water was spreading out, moving faster than a man could run, faster than a Model T could drive through the mud. The containment was over. The river had broken America, and the ocean was now moving inland. When the sun finally broke through the clouds in May of 1927, it didn't shine on the Mississippi Delta. It shone on an inland sea. The statistics from the history books are staggering. 27,000 square miles inundated inundated, water 30 feet deep in some town squares, an area roughly the size of Scotland completely submerged. But the numbers don't tell you what it felt like. It felt like the end of the world. The Mississippi River, usually a mile or so wide, had bloated into a monster 80 miles across. If you were navigating a rescue skiff through this new, waterlogged world, the landscape was surreal. You weren't looking at a riverbank. You were motoring over the tops of pecan groves. You'd pass the second-story window of a submerged farmhouse and see a family's dining room table floating in the eddy. The silence was the most haunting part. The roar of the breach was gone, replaced by the lap of water against wood and the buzzing of millions of mosquitoes breeding in the stagnant heat. The smell was inescapable, a suffocating reek of rotting vegetation, gasoline slicks, and the carcasses of livestock that had nowhere to run. For the nearly 700,000 people displaced by the flood, the only dry land left was the very thing that had failed them, the levees. The narrow tops of these earthen walls became long, linear islands crowded with humanity. This is where the social fabric of the 1920s didn't just fray, it tore completely apart. The relief effort was massive, dubbed the peacetime equivalent of the Great War, helmed by Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover. The Red Cross descended with tents, rations, and flatboats. But on those narrow strips of dirt, the good old days mythology falls apart completely. The refugee camps were strictly segregated, and the experience of the flood depended entirely on the color of your skin. For white families, the camps were uncomfortable but temporary stopping points before evacuation. They were often whisked away on steamers to dry cities like Vicksburg or Memphis. For African-American sharecroppers, the levees became open-air prisons. The local planners, terrified that their labor force would use the flood as an excuse to escape the debt peonage of the Delta, insisted that black refugees be kept on the levees. They were corralled by the National Guard. To receive rations, cornbread, molasses, perhaps some salt pork, men were often forced to work, unloading heavy crates from barges or clearing debris in the sticky, humid heat. They were issued tags, like luggage, identifying which plantation they belonged to. You couldn't just leave. If you tried to board a relief boat heading north without a pass from your employer, you were turned back at gunpoint. It was a humanitarian crisis wrapped in a labor dispute, played out on a strip of mud surrounded by endless water. Yet, amidst this dystopian reality, a new sound was rising from the camps. It was the sound of the Delta blues. Musicians like Charlie Patton were there, witnessing the devastation firsthand. Patton's voice, gravelly and intense, documented the horror in high water everywhere. He sang about the water rising, the women crying, and the total indifference of the world around them. This wasn't entertainment, it was reporting. It was the only news broadcast that told the truth about life on the levee. As the weeks dragged into months, the water slowly, agonizingly receded. It left behind a landscape coated in a thick gray sludge. Houses were filled with muck up to the rafters. The cotton crop for the year was gone. The mules were dead. The debt was higher than ever. For thousands of families, this was the final straw. The flood of 1927 broke the psychological dam that had held people in the South. The promise of the Delta, that if you worked hard enough, the land would provide, had been revealed as a lie. The land had tried to kill them, and the society they lived in had locked them on a levee while it happened. The result was a demographic tidal wave. As soon as the water went down and the National Guard packed up, the people began to pack up too. They didn't rebuild the shacks. They saved their pennies, bought train tickets, and looked north. This was a turbocharger for the Great Migration. They took the Illinois Central Railroad straight up the gut of the country, heading for Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis. They took their few belongings, but more importantly, they took their culture. They took the blues, which would plug into amplifiers in Chicago and become rock and roll. They took the culinary traditions that would define American comfort food. They took the stories of the water that rose and never stopped. The floodwaters eventually drained back into the Gulf of Mexico, but the watermark remained. The sheer cost of the disaster forced the federal government to finally take responsibility for the river. The Flood Control Act of 1928 was passed, launching the massive engineering projects that we see today: concrete revetments, spillways, and reservoirs. It was the end of the levees-only arrogance, but for the people who lived through it, the engineering didn't matter anymore. They had seen the fragility of their existence. They learned that nature doesn't bargain, and that when the water rises, you have to save yourself. The Mississippi River had redrawn the map, not just by moving soil, but by moving souls. The Great Flood of 1927 washed away more than just cotton fields and farmhouses. It washed away the illusion of control. Before the water rose, America believed it could tame nature with enough dirt and willpower. After the water fell, we built a fortress of concrete and steel, creating a safer, drier, but more artificial relationship with our greatest river. We gained security. We stopped the river from wandering, but we lost the raw, terrifying intimacy with the land that defined a generation. And in driving people from the Delta to the industrial North, the flood accidentally gave the world the rhythm of modern music. The water receded, but the echoes of 1927 are still vibrating in every blues riff and rock anthem we hear today.